This is Group A's presentation of Bastard Tongues by Derek Bickerton. Questions. What do you think of when you hear the word Creole? A Louisiana bayou fisherman? A simplified version of French or English? A language that can teach us the very foundations of human communication? What is a pidgin language? How did Creole language originate? Why is pidgin a makeshift language and Creole a full language? Why does Creole tend to thrive with slave immigrants on small islands? Why didn't they just learn the language of the ruling class? Why do children learn to speak fluent Creole, but their parents usually do not? What can Creole language teach us about the origin of human languages? If two children were put together, could they make a language without outside input? Bastard Tongues centers on the life and work of its author, Derek Bickerton, a renowned linguist specializing in Creole languages and a professor emeritus at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. The story begins in the year 1966, at the turn of Bickerton's professional career. As is the running theme in the story, the author's life takes a radical turn from teaching English literature to linguistics after a few drinks in a bar with a fellow teacher. For this change in career, the British government would compensate him $45 a week while he attended 1 year of linguistics courses, where he is first introduced to Chomsky's then-new Theories of Universal Grammar. Upon his graduation, he lands a job with the University of Lancaster, where he'd be spending the next 4 years in the South American country of Guyana, which had been under British rule until May of 1966. His task, to learn why Guyanese children struggled with English. They seemed to speak some type of hybrid language that interfered with learning proper English. This would be his first introduction in the world of Creole languages. Bickerton's first exploration into Creole leads him to theorize that the reason Creole has such a variety of vocabulary and grammar within a small area is because of the isolation of the slave-run sugar plantations. At the time, there were 3 popular theories for how Creole languages originate: the superstrate, substrate, and monogenesis theories. Bickerton notices that the varieties of Creole in different parts couldn't be explained by any of these 3 theories, so he embarks on a journey to formulate a new theory called the bioprogram, which is a kind of biological template for grammar that synergizes with the work of leading scholars such as Chomsky. In order to collect data from native Creole speakers, Bickerton, armed with a small tape recorder, goes bar hopping so that he can talk to working-class speakers on their home turf. He documents their syntax, morphology, and semantics to form a range of the Creole language throughout Guyana. He discovers a wide variety of dialects within Creole speakers, leading him to hypothesize that Creole has many different sociolects, dialects based not on geographic location but on social criteria: education, age, class, sex, and occupation. His idea, which would later prove to be wrong, was that after slaves were freed by their masters, their social movement affected their Creole. Bickerton heads off to a Creole languages conference in Jamaica. He learns more about the theory of Creole monogenesis through a presentation that highlights the striking linguistic similarities between Creole languages in different parts of the world. While Bickerton disagrees with the theory, the similarities between Creole languages would become vital to his own theories on how Creole language formation is connected to the origin of all human language. As Bickerton collects data, he develops a better understanding of the grammar of Creole. The author finishes up his 4-year contract in Guyana and heads back to England, only to learn that the University of Lancaster reneged on its promise of a tenured position. He plays hardball, scabs during a union strike, and then gets a 6-month full salary paid leave for the remainder of his contract. He uses that time to analyze the data he had collected from his time in the Caribbean and South America. Bickerton accepts a position at the University of Hawaii to study the Pidgin and Creole languages of the islands. He gets a 6-figure grant to interview 200 Hawaiians. During his research, he is surprised by linguistic similarities, such as the tense modality aspect systems that were almost identical between the Creole in Guyana and the Creole in Hawaii. Other Creole experts had noted similarities as well, but they attributed them as being transmitted from other countries via shipping routes. Bickerton doesn't agree, which leads him to develop his own theory as to why Creoles around the world share so many grammatical similarities. Bickerton links Creole development to Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar. He theorizes that pidgin languages were invented by immigrant adults when various languages came into contact with each other, but the formation of a robust Creole language happened when their children restructured pidgin using their natural internal language program. Bickerton decides that he, along with fellow UCLA linguist Tom Guyven, will conduct an experiment. If they brought together 6 pairs of speakers of different languages, along with their children, and introduced a new vocabulary, would the parents pidginize it and their children turn it into Creole? In selecting the participants for the experiment, they wanted to get speakers of different language families with varying word order systems, such as SVO, SOV, and VSO. It was to be a 3-year experiment. Unfortunately, the project is put on hold and then gets modified so heavily by the National Science Foundation that Tom and the author decide to scrap it. Bickerton changes directions and starts to pen a book called Roots of Language to answer 3 questions. How did Creole languages originate? How do children acquire language? And how did human language originate? He would look to the Creole and Pidgin languages formed on French colonial plantation islands for his answers. His theory, because slave plantations can function in isolation to the rest of the world, they become universes unto themselves. Though starting from a blank slate is almost impossible, sugar plantation islands came as close to a blank slate as anywhere in human history. Bickerton postulates that Creole develops over 3 phases of the life of a plantation business: establishment, expansion, and plateau. The bridge language of the owners will first be pidginized by the slaves as they learn the trade from their masters, and then, as the business expands and the ratio of slaves to masters widens, the slaves distort the language so heavily that their children instinctively reconstruct the language into Creole. Bickerton returns to the history of Guyana Creole with his new theory in mind to analyze the history of 2 forms of Creole that developed in the late 1600s, Saranan and Saramaccan. He concludes that they did not spawn from one Creole parent language and then split, but rather were pieced together by the human bio program from the mix of English and Dutch the slaves had available to them. The author goes to Amsterdam to talk with Suriname Creole speakers, which is the Dutch-influenced Creole. He interviews Creole speakers, asking them if sentences he constructed, which included the lower-class Creole grammar feature of serial verbs, sound grammatical. All say no but one, the descendant of a ruling class, white plantation owner who accepts the Creole as grammatical. Bickerton theorizes that the children of plantation owners must have played with the children of slave workers. This accounted for children of plantation owners learning the lowest form of Creole. Bickerton decides to go to the islands of Seychelles off the Kenyan coast. He determined that 2 forms of Creole existed on the islands. The first was a middle-class Creole that was formalized into Standard Creole, leaving the lower, working-class version to be considered bad. On the nearby island of La Digue, he finds a Creole speaker who speaks using predicate clefting, something that wasn't supposed to happen outside the Caribbean. Bickerton's journey leads him back to Hawaii. In addition to the island having the most recent formations of Pidgin and Creole in the world, the languages are a blend of both European and Asian languages. One of Bickerton's undergraduates decides to explore some of the author's earlier work and advances the study of Pidgin in Hawaii. She sources court records for linguistic data. Surprisingly, all of the blends of Creole have remarkably similar grammar structures in spite of the fact that the languages they come from, for example Japanese, Chinese, English, and Hawaiian, had a wide variety of grammars. Bickerton's explanation is that only a human bio program for language could explain why so many Creole languages are so linguistically similar. In the book's final chapter, he starts to examine how deaf people develop sign language when there is an absence of formal sign language taught to them. He examines Nicaraguan children, especially what happens when isolated deaf children come into contact with children who used lenguaje de señas nicaragüense. The author, citing the critical theory hypothesis, surmises that because the children were older, they couldn't develop more complex language. The final pages of the book are an appeal from Bickerton to conduct the human language experiments he was unable to get approval for earlier in his career. he outlines that the experiments could be done on orphans under the promise that they wouldn't be permanently damaged from depriving the children of input and that they would be financially compensated later in life. After all, he justifies, Creole is born from horrific circumstances. Many linguists view language in the same way a chemist looks at a beaker of dihydrogen monoxide and sodium, as fascinating, occasionally dangerous, and best approached with the utmost caution and sterility. Most of the action occurs in the pages of academic journals and in the chairs of offices and conference rooms, comfortably situated within the so-called ivory tower of academia. In his novel Bastard Tongues, Derek Bickerton defies this overly academic way of doing things in a memoir of his decades-long investigation into the origins of Creole languages. Gritty, pugilistic, macho, and full of vivid detail, Bickerton's is the tale of a self-described street linguist. As a result, the narrative persona he chooses to express is anything but that of a standard ivory tower academic. While the novel's focus is by no means on purely the content of his research, Bastard Tongues successfully delineates Bickerton's evolving ideas on the origins of Creole and educates readers on the relevant parts of linguistics and does so in a highly engaging and narrative fashion. Bickerton portrays himself and his closest colleagues in opposition to the establishment of the day. In reference to his fellow linguist Ian Hancock, he writes, "We were kindred spirits. We shared a taste for low life and scatological humor, and a total lack of respect for the respectable." Based on the picture painted in the novel, it is plausible to believe that he spent more hours of his time sitting on a bar stool than in an office chair over the course of his career, purportedly in pursuit of the deepest Creole among the working class. This impatience with all things respectable and procedural, what he terms word wastage, bathes the story in a light of focus on results. After finishing his doctorate, he believed that he had finally cleared all the nonsense out of the way and could now get on with the serious business of life, which is, of course, finding out stuff. This kind of gung-ho, both-feet-first attitude toward discovery infectiously spreads throughout the rest of the novel, in which he tells of quests in Guyana, Hawaii, Mauritius, and elsewhere, in pursuit of finding out stuff about the world's lowliest languages. The central thread of linguistic inquiry running throughout the novel is that of discovering the origin of Pidgin and Creole languages. Initially, he published a paper about Creoles in Guyana that conceptualized the varieties of this Creole as snapshots of language history. He later decided he had gotten it backward and settled on another explanation, that Creoles are the result of what Bickerton calls a bio-program. The bio-program is contained within the minds of the children who learned the Pidgin from their parents. This argument is logical and well-supported, undergirded with historical and linguistic evidence from a very wide range of sources, including Hawaiian court records and Nicaraguan schools for the deaf, and couched in a compelling narrative that charges through from start to finish. One especially noticeable thread of the narrative is the way his movements from place to place were born not only of successes, but also failures in academia and family life, from flying halfway around the world to find his position already filled, to being forced to live hundreds of miles from his wife. Despite the challenges Bickerton describes, the sense of momentum and grand adventure never fades. Like an energetic underdog in a prize fight, he always seems to pick himself back up and go after the serious business of life and relish the simple joy of finding out stuff. By the end of the story, you can't help but root for him as he forges ahead to try to make his next big discovery. This novel is an excellent read for students of linguistics, both formal and informal, who wish to learn more about the concepts of the field. It would be inadvisable for one to pick up the book without so much as a passing interest in the functioning and analysis of language. Of those who are at least vaguely interested in language, it is a particularly good fit if you enjoy reading about a man who feels as though he is on the edge of civilization, searching for answers to fundamental questions of how humans function in the most secluded corners of the world. If you are interested in learning about the study of language and seeing it applied in an adventure across decades and continents, then Bastard Tongues is the book for you. Have paper, will travel. That's what life in academia is about. A book about Creole languages as seen by one linguist wouldn't seem to be applicable to a course on critical pedagogy at first sight. As we read, however, we start to see through Bickerton's eyes, especially with the lush way he writes about language. He refers to it like digestion, or breathing, or circulating the blood. You have no need to know. Your brain does it all for you, deep down, below the level of consciousness. Nonetheless, Bickerton reminds us that we should constantly be questioning language and seeking reasons behind why we use language in the ways we do. Bickerton writes about the way he studied for his graduate courses compared to other students, stating that most students read passively. They see themselves as vessels waiting to be filled, and that he assumes instead that part of the stuff, maybe most of it, will be wrong. Bickerton's description of the other students could almost have been lifted from Frere's Pedagogy of the Oppressed when he describes the banking method of education. The banking method of education doesn't account for the fact that knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry men pursue in the world, and with each other. Creole languages were new languages, things that sprang up seemingly out of nowhere whenever people speaking mutually incomprehensible languages were put in contact with one another over long periods of time. Creole languages are born out of the pidginization of two or more existing languages. They could be considered a dialectical contradiction, which is a unity or internal relation of two opposites that could not exist outside the way in which they are related. The Creole languages that Bickerton studied were often born out of the forced migration of African slaves. They would share, in addition to their home culture, the experience of migration and the blend of values, behaviors, and attitudes they adopt in the process of acculturation. The contact points between the slaves' cultures and that of the Europeans, as well as other cultures that they came into contact with, would all become part of the new culture that was eventually created. In terms of identity, critical theorists aim to explode the concretized categories of race, class, gender, and sexuality, and to claim the intersections, the borderlands, as the space to create a new culture, una cultura mestizo, in which the only normative standard is hybridity and all subjects are constructed as inherently transgressive. As the creation of these Creole languages shaped the surrounding culture, language was viewed as a carrier of culture and culture as a carrier of language, so that shifts in one reverberate in the other. In one of his studies, Bickerton was dealing with what were coming to be known as sociolects, dialects based not on geographic location but on social criteria, education, age, class, sex, and occupation. Shore quotes Frere, saying that the need to master the dominant language is not only to survive, but also to better fight the transformation of an unjust and cruel society where the subordinate groups are rejected, insulted, and humiliated. This would be especially important as, in the past, slave owners took deliberate steps to rid the slaves of their indigenous African languages. There appeared to be a policy not to have several slaves speaking the same language on a plantation for fear that they would teach others the language, and that speaking the same language would make it easy for slaves to plan an escape or a slave revolt. The slaves were not allowed to become educated, separating them from the outside world. Education as the practice of freedom, as opposed to education as the practice of domination, denies that man is abstract, isolated, independent, and unattached to the world. It also denies that the world exists as a reality apart from men. Many times the ability to speak proper English was seen as the ability to move upward socioeconomically, although some are afraid that mastering proper English will cause them to lose their black dialect identity. Language, no matter which language it is fateful in teaching us what kind of people to become and what kind of society to make. Discourse is not destiny. It was and is convenient because of a phenomenon known as code switching. Code switching is one of those things, like talking prose, that you've been doing all your life without realizing it. Code switching can be useful when switching between social circles and situations. This also means that the oppressed could develop their own psychological oppressor within themselves. The oppressor within is the psychological result of the social and material relations between the oppressors and the oppressed. The oppressor's ideology of ways of thinking, motives, ways of behaving, actually penetrates the subjectivities of the oppressed. For many, border crossing and the idea of a shifting identity is, thus, neither new nor revolutionary to the indigenous community, but rather the way of life of Quechua peoples for over 500 years. When referencing deaf children in Nicaragua, Bickerton states, biological capacities don't just emerge automatically, in the absence of any relevant experience. In order to function properly, any biological capacity has to be used, or it won't develop. The ability to use language or sign language allows students to form a peer group of their own. These groups are between students of shared cultures, often a culture that is not shared by their teacher if the students are part of a minority group. If the teacher is not part of the student's culture, then issues of group identity may also affect students' oral production of a different dialect, especially if they are made to feel that their own culture and dialect are not valued by their teacher. These schools then become a site of reproduction, resistance, and social transformation. The teacher must be willing to view the student's culture as just as valuable as their own. The pursuit of full humanity, however, cannot be carried out in isolation or individualism, but only in fellowship and solidarity. Therefore, it cannot unfold in the antagonistic relations between oppressors and oppressed. No one can be authentically human while he prevents others from being so. Once an environment of mutual respect is established, the emergence of a situated third idiom can suggest that some of the power conflicts between students and teacher are being worked through, because the participants are co-constructing a new code not identical to the ones they brought to class. And here's a list of some of our favorite quotes from the book. According to that training, the native speaker of any language was the ultimate authority on it. No one apparently had anticipated two native speakers who disagreed on virtually everything. There is a rule of hospitality in Guyana that says if there's a bottle on the table, nobody gets up until it's finished. Drunks are the world's most underrated language teaching resource. Who broke English? How did they break it? Why is it broken in that way and not in some other way? In light of the bio program, however, the solution is clear. The human mind holds a set of meanings that have to be grammaticized, expressed in terms of grammatical forms like articles, auxiliaries, prepositions, and the like. People sometimes act as if pidgin speakers were stupid, but they're far from stupid. They're really ingenious. When they don't remember a word, they'll work around it until you get the message. They'll use words from your language if they know them. If not, they'll use words from their own in hope that you know them, and failing that, words from any other language that might happen to be around. That's pidgin. But the more you look at languages, the more you realize that 1, it's very hard to draw boundaries between them, and 2, under all those scary but superficial differences, they're much more alike than you'd think. Words and how they're pronounced differ from language to language and have to be learned. Grammar doesn't. Words are unconstrained by anything except human creativity, but grammar depends on principles that all languages share. Principles that derive, in ways still mysterious but by no means undiscoverable, from the working of the human brain. For Creoles are not bastard tongues after all. Quite the contrary, they are the purest expression we know of the human capacity for language. Other languages creak and groan under the burden of time. Like ships on a long voyage, they are encrusted with the barnacles of freaky constructions, illogical exceptions, obsolete usages. Their convoluted recesses facilitate lying and deceit. But Creoles spring pure and clear from the very fountain of language, and their emergence, through all the horrors of slavery, represents a triumph of all that's strongest and most enduring in the human spirit.